The town of Blackwood Hollow had never been the same since that night. Two bodies, Emily Carter and Daniel Graves, found in the old mill by the river, their deaths as brutal as they were baffling. The police had combed through every clue, interrogated every suspect, and chased every lead. But after 3 years, the case grew cold. The killer had vanished like smoke, leaving behind a town drowning in fear and suspicion. Some whispered that the murderer had fled far away. Others swore they still walked among them, hiding in plain sight. Then one rain-soaked evening, the mayor made a call he'd resisted for years. He dialed the number of the one man who had never failed to solve a case, the one who had walked away from it all. Lucas Vane lived in isolation now, a recluse in a cabin at the edge of the woods. His reputation was legendary, a detective with an uncanny ability to see what others missed. But the shadows of his past cases weighed on him, and he had no interest in stepping back into that world. When the mayor's car pulled up his muddy driveway, Lucas didn't even open the door. "I'm done," he said through the window. The mayor slid a manila envelope under the crack. "Just look at it. That's all I'm asking." Lucas left it there for 2 days, but on the third night, something made him pick it up. Inside were crime scene photos, witness statements, and a single faded Polaroid of the victims, happy, alive, unaware of what was coming. Then his fingers brushed against something else, a missing page, deliberately torn from the file, and that's when he saw it. A tiny symbol, barely noticeable, etched into the corner of the photo. A symbol he'd seen before. Lucas Vane was no longer done. The symbol was faint, almost like a careless scratch, but Lucas knew better. It was deliberate, a small inverted triangle with a line through it, nearly hidden in the shadow of Emily's sleeve. He'd seen it years ago in another case, one that had never been closed. A suspect had carved the same mark into a wooden table during interrogation, then laughed when no one understood its meaning. That man had vanished before trial, his file mysteriously wiped clean. Now, here it was again. Lucas spread the photos across his desk, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He hadn't wanted to return to this life, but the symbol changed everything. It was a taunt, a signature. And if he was right, the killer wasn't just still out there. He was watching. The next morning, Lucas drove into Blackwood Hollow under a gray, heavy sky. The town felt different from the last time he'd visited. Quieter, tenser. People moved quickly, eyes darting, as if afraid to linger too long in one place. The police station was worse. The moment he stepped inside, conversations died mid-sentence. Chief Rollins, a broad-shouldered man with deep lines of exhaustion on his face, looked like he'd seen a ghost. "You're really doing this?" he asked, voice low. Lucas didn't answer. He just laid the Polaroid on the desk and pointed to the symbol. Rollins paled. That wasn't there before. Lucas knew what that meant. Evidence had been tampered with. Someone had tried to erase the mark. Or worse, someone had planted it later. He spent hours going through the old case files, cross-referencing names, alibis, every tiny inconsistency. Most of it was exactly as he expected. Sloppy work, rushed conclusions, blind spots big enough to drive a truck through. But one thing stood out, a witness statement from a local shopkeeper buried near the bottom of the pile. He claimed he'd seen a man near the mill that night, someone he recognized but couldn't place. The description was vague, average height, dark jacket, but one detail jumped out. The man had been carrying a toolbox. Lucas leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. A toolbox. That didn't fit. None of the reports mentioned forced entry, no signs of a struggle that would require tools. So why bring one? Unless it wasn't for breaking in, unless it was for something else entirely. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He needed to see the mill for himself. The old mill stood rotting at the edge of Blackwood Hollow's river, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at anyone brave enough to approach. The police tape had long since faded, the wood splintered and sagging under years of neglect. Lucas stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, the air thick with the scent of damp wood, and something darker, something metallic that never quite faded no matter how much time passed. He moved slowly, deliberately, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, illuminating dust-covered footprints that shouldn't have been there. Fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. He crouched near the spot where Emily's body had been found. The floor still stained in a way that no amount of scrubbing could erase. The police reports had called it a crime of passion, messy, brutal, unplanned. But Lucas wasn't so sure. The way the blood had splattered, the precision of the wounds, the lack of defensive marks on the victim's hands. This wasn't rage. This was calculation. His light flickered over the far wall, catching on something the original investigators had missed. A series of shallow scratches, too deliberate to be accidental, forming the same inverted triangle from the photo. A floorboard creaked behind him. Lucas froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun he no longer carried. He turned just in time to see a shadow slip out the door, a figure moving fast, disappearing into the trees. He lunged forward, but by the time he reached the entrance, there was nothing. No sound of footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the heavy silence of the woods. Whoever it was knew the area, knew how to vanish. Lucas exhaled sharply, his pulse loud in his ears. He wasn't just dealing with a killer. He was dealing with someone who enjoyed the game. Back at his cabin, he spread out every piece of evidence again, his mind racing. The toolbox, the symbol, the fact that someone had been watching him tonight. It all pointed to one terrifying possibility. The killer wasn't just still in Blackwood Hollow. He was part of the investigation. Someone who had access to files, who could plant evidence, who could walk in and out of a crime scene without raising suspicion. Lucas flipped through the witness list again, pausing on a name he'd skimmed over before. Gregory Harlow, the town's coroner, the man who had examined both bodies, the man who had signed off on every autopsy report, and the man who, according to the file, had been the first to arrive at the mill that night. Gregory Harlow had been a fixture in Blackwood Hollow for nearly 2 decades. A quiet, meticulous man who performed autopsies with an almost artistic precision. He attended every town funeral, offered condolences with a practiced solemnity, and even volunteered to speak at the memorials for Emily and Daniel. The kind of man people trusted instinctively. Lucas sat in his car outside the coroner's office, watching through the rain-streaked windshield as Harlow locked up for the night, his movements unhurried, routine. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about him, nothing that would raise alarms. But that was the problem. The best killers didn't stand out. They blended in. They made themselves indispensable. Lucas waited until Harlow's taillights disappeared down the street before slipping around the back of the building. The lock on the rear door was old, rusted, easy enough to pick for someone with his experience. Inside, the air smelled of formaldehyde and bleach, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. He moved past rows of stainless steel tables, his shoes sticking slightly to the tiled floor, until he reached the filing cabinet in the corner. Harlow's autopsy reports were neatly organized, each one detailed to the point of obsession. But when Lucas pulled the files for Emily and Daniel, he noticed something odd. The pages were crisp, untouched, unlike the slightly yellowed edges of the older reports. These weren't originals. They were copies. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Lucas snapped the file shut, his breath catching. The sound hadn't come from outside. It was inside the building. Someone else was here. He killed the flashlight, pressing himself against the wall as footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate. A shadow stretched across the doorway, then paused. Lucas could hear breathing now, shallow and controlled. Then just as suddenly as they'd come, the footsteps retreated, fading back down the hall. He waited a full minute before exhaling, his hands trembling slightly. That hadn't been a janitor. Whoever it was had been searching for something, or someone. He turned his attention back to the files, flipping through them faster now. Near the back of Daniel's report, he found it. A single sentence that didn't match the clinical tone of the rest. Subject showed signs of prior trauma, possibly from a bladed tool, inconsistent with stated history. Lucas frowned. Daniel's family had insisted he'd never been injured, never been in fights. So where had those scars come from? And why had Harlow noted it like an afterthought, buried where no one would see? He pocketed the page and headed for the door, pausing only when his foot knocked against something under the desk. A toolbox, its metal surface dull with age. The same one from the witness statement. Outside, the rain had turned into a downpour, the streets empty and slick with water. Lucas barely noticed. His mind was racing, pieces slotting together in a way that made his stomach twist. Harlow had been at the mill that night. He'd had access to the bodies. He'd hidden evidence. But why? What connected him to the victims? And why leave that symbol behind, like some kind of macabre signature? He needed to see the original autopsy photos, the ones Harlow had undoubtedly kept for himself, the ones that would show the truth. But first, he needed to talk to someone who'd known Emily and Daniel better than anyone, someone the killer might have overlooked. The home of Margaret Graves, Daniel's elderly mother, sat at the end of a winding lane overgrown with ivy, its paint peeling under the weight of years and grief. She answered the door before Lucas could knock, her eyes sharp despite the deep lines of sorrow etched into her face. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, voice brittle but steady. The house smelled of lavender and old books, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. She led him to a sitting room cluttered with photographs. Daniel as a child, Daniel in his high school graduation robe, Daniel with Emily, both of them laughing under a summer sky. Lucas hesitated before speaking, watching her hands tremble around the teacup she held. "Mrs. Graves," he began, "did your son ever mention knowing Gregory Harlow before that night?" The cup clattered against the saucer. Her breath hitched, just for a second, before she set it down with deliberate care. "No," she said too quickly. "Why would he?" Lucas leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "Because I think Harlow knew him. I think he knew both of them." He pulled the autopsy report from his pocket, pointing to the damning line about Daniel's scars. Margaret's face drained of color. For a long moment she said nothing. Then with a shuddering sigh, she stood and walked to an old oak desk in the corner, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "3 years ago," she whispered, "Daniel came home with his arm bandaged. He said it was nothing, just a cut from working on his car. But when I changed the dressing, it wasn't a cut. It was a mark, like a brand. This symbol," she slid a photograph across the table, a close-up of Daniel's forearm, the skin raised and angry, forming that same inverted triangle with a line through it. Lucas's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a killer leaving a signature. This was something older, something ritualistic. He thought of the toolbox, the precision of the wounds, the way Harlow had documented everything with such detached interest. "Did Daniel ever say where he got this?" Margaret shook her head, tears spilling over. "Number." But the next week Emily came by, upset. She said she'd seen the same mark somewhere. She wouldn't tell me where, just that she was scared. 2 days later, they were both dead. Lucas pocketed the photo, his mind racing. Emily had seen the symbol. That's why she'd been killed. But why Daniel? Unless he'd known too much. Unless he'd been involved. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than he'd imagined. This wasn't just a murder, it was a purge. Someone was tying up loose ends. As he stood to leave, Margaret grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have to understand," she whispered. "Gregory Harlow wasn't just the coroner here. Before that, he worked upstate at Blackwood Asylum. It closed down after incidents. They said patients were disappearing. He's the only one who walked away clean." Lucas stiffened. An asylum. Experiments. Brands. Suddenly, the inverted triangle made horrible sense. It wasn't a signature. It was a label. He left Margaret's house as twilight deepened into night, the streetlights flickering on, one by one. He needed to get to the asylum. If Harlow had kept trophies, that's where they'd be. But as he turned the key in the ignition, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. The message was a single sentence. "You're closer than the others. But the dead don't speak, Mr. Vane, and neither will you." Lucas looked up just in time to see headlights flare to life behind him, speeding straight toward his car. The impact sent Lucas's car lurching forward, tires screeching against wet asphalt as the world spun in a dizzying blur of shattered glass and twisted metal. His head slammed against the steering wheel, pain exploding behind his eyes, but adrenaline forced his limbs into motion. He kicked the crumpled door open just as the smell of gasoline hit his nostrils. Thick, nauseating, a death sentence if he hesitated. Rolling onto the pavement, he barely cleared the wreck before the flames erupted, heat searing the back of his neck as the explosion rocked the quiet street. Distantly, he heard screams, footsteps running toward him, but his focus locked onto the retreating taillights of the truck that had hit him. It didn't speed away. It idled at the end of the block, as if waiting to see if he'd survived. Lucas staggered to his feet, blood trickling from his temple, his ribs screaming with every breath. The truck's engine revved once, a challenge, then vanished into the night. This wasn't just a warning, it was a performance. Harlow knew Lucas was digging too deep, getting too close, and now he was playing with him, savoring the hunt. The message on his phone proved it. The dead don't speak. But Lucas had spent a lifetime listening to them anyway. He limped toward the outskirts of town where Blackwood Asylum loomed, its broken turrets clawing at the moonlit sky. The place had been abandoned for years, its gates hanging crookedly from rusted hinges, the air thick with the scent of decay and something sharper, chemicals old and lingering. The front doors were boarded up, but the basement entrance gaped open like a wound, the padlock long since pried away. Inside, the darkness was absolute, the beam of his flashlight revealing peeling walls scrawled with names, dates, frantic pleas for help etched into the stone. The deeper he went, the colder it got, until his breath fogged in the air. Then he found the room. A single steel table stood in the center, stained dark with old blood, restraints still bolted to the sides. Shelves lined the walls cluttered with jars, each one containing something unspeakable. Fingers, teeth, a single human eye floating in formaldehyde, its iris a pale, milky blue. Lucas's stomach turned, but it was the ledger on the desk that stopped him cold. Page after page of names, dates, and beside each one, that same inverted triangle. Daniel's name was there. Emily's too. And at the bottom of the last page, a fresh entry, the ink barely dry. Lucas Vane. A floorboard groaned behind him. He spun, flashlight raised, but the beam only illuminated empty air. Then a voice, soft and mocking, echoed from the shadows. I wondered if you'd come here first. Harlow stepped into the light, his face eerily calm, a scalpel glinting in his hand. You're smarter than the others, I'll give you that. But you made one mistake. He tilted his head, smiling. You thought I was hiding. I've been right beside you since the beginning. At the memorials, the press conferences, even when they buried them. He took a step closer, the scalpel twirling between his fingers. I watched you cry. Lucas's blood turned to ice. Harlow hadn't just attended the funerals. He'd orchestrated them. Every speech, every tear, every moment of false closure, all part of the game. And now the game was ending. The flickering beam of Lucas's flashlight trembled slightly as he took an unsteady step back, his boots crunching over broken glass and dried blood that still clung to the asylum's rotting floorboards. Harlow's smile widened at the movement, his teeth gleaming like bone in the dim light, the scalpel catching fractured reflections from the jars lining the walls. You still don't see it, do you? Harlow murmured, tilting his head with the curiosity of a surgeon examining a specimen. All those years solving cases, and you never realized the truth. Monsters don't lurk in shadows. We stand in the light. We hand out tissues at funerals. We bring casseroles to grieving families. His voice dropped to a whisper. We sign the autopsy reports that make sure no one looks too closely. Lucas's hand inched toward the fire axe hanging crookedly on the wall behind him, his fingers brushing the handle. He needed to keep Harlow talking, needed him distracted. The asylum, Lucas said, forcing his voice steady. This is where it started. You weren't just an employee here. You were experimenting on them, branding them. That symbol wasn't your signature. It was their designation. Harlow's grin turned sharp, pleased. Very good. They called it treatment. Cutting away the weak, the flawed, the impure. But the board shut us down, called it unethical. He spread his arms, gesturing to the jars. I was preserving the work, and then Daniel stumbled onto my private collection. Emily followed him. They were going to ruin everything. The axe handle was cold in Lucas's grip. He shifted his weight, ready. And the others? The missing patients? Harlow sighed as if disappointed by the question. Sacrifices require precision, Mr. Vane. I was perfecting my craft. His gaze flicked to the axe for the briefest second. He knew, but it was too late. Lucas swung with all the strength he had left. The blade connected with Harlow's shoulder, a wet crunch echoing through the room as the coroner screamed, the scalpel clattering to the floor. Lucas didn't hesitate. He brought the axe down again, this time aiming for the leg, and Harlow collapsed, his blood pooling black in the dim light. Gasping, Lucas pressed his boot against Harlow's throat, the axe raised for a final blow. The coroner wheezed, choking on his own laughter. You? You think this ends with me? He spat. The board knew. The mayor knew. They all let it happen. His eyes rolled back, his body going slack as unconsciousness took him. Lucas stood there shaking, the weight of the words settling over him like a shroud. Harlow was right. This town's sickness ran deeper than one man. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had reported the explosion. Lucas took one last look at the ledger, at his name written in Harlow's meticulous script, then dropped a lit match onto the gasoline-soaked floor. The flames roared to life, devouring the evidence, the horrors, the truth. Let the town think Harlow died in the fire. Let them sleep easier, believing the monster was gone. But as Lucas disappeared into the trees, the first licks of firelight casting long shadows behind him, he knew the real work was just beginning. Somewhere out there, others like Harlow were still standing in the light, and he would find them.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.